Today on the Digging Podcast, I'm joined by Dr. Joshua Bowen, Ph.D. in Assyriology from Johns Hopkins University, founder of Digital Hammurabi, and a man who will tell you straight up that he does not share our faith. He's an atheist. And he might be one of the most important voices you hear on this podcast all year. Here's why Dr. Bowen has spent his career buried in the cuneiform record, clay tablets, dead empires, the actual written remains of Sumer, Babylonia, and Assyria, the civilizations that existed centuries before Israel, that wrote flood stories before Genesis, that carved law codes into stone before Moses climbed the mountain. He reads those languages. He works those primary sources every single day. And what he has found does not destroy the Bible. It puts it in a world, a real world, a specific world, one that most Christians have never been introduced to. I'm not bringing Dr. Bowen on to attack your faith. I'm bringing him on because I believe serious Christians should be able to sit across from the best scholarship available, including scholarship from people who do not believe what we believe, and come out on the other side with a deeper understanding of Scripture, not a shallower one. And if that makes you uncomfortable, good. Stay with me, because now it's time to dig in. Welcome, everybody, to the Dig In Podcast. I am your host, Pastor Johnny Ova, with the sound of heaven. And today we have a very special guest, which is going to be an enlightening conversation for sure, Dr. Joshua Bowen. Dr. Bowen, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So let's jump right into our conversation, Dr. Bowen. Before we get into the specifics here, I want to set the stage. So when we talk about the ancient Near East and Mesopotamia, what world are we actually talking about? And why should someone who loves the Bible care deeply about it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the ancient Near East is, scholars generally talk about this with respect to ancient Iraq and Syria. And the time span is normally from about 3000 BCE down to the time of Alexander the Great. That's sort of the general bracketing that scholars talk about. So, this is, if you think about where Iraq is, Syria, is in relation to the southern Levant and where, the events of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament took place. It's very much within that range. And certainly, Abraham in the text in Genesis is said to have come from Ur of the Chaldeans, which is down in southern Mesopotamia. So, just on its face, it's a pretty important culture to understand if you're interested in the Bible. But of course, there's a lot more behind that. But I guess generally speaking, there's a lot of interaction between the kingdoms of Israel and Judah and Mesopotamia. So if you think about the Assyrians, the New Assyrian period. The Assyrians conquer Samaria in 722 BCE. And then, of course, the Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar, the very famous Nebuchadnezzar from the book of Daniel and elsewhere, conquers Judah in the south. And so, captivity, deportation, these are all things that sort of focus on Mesopotamia. So it's an important thing to understand, I think.
Definitely. It's one of the reasons why, honestly, we have the show. And what I'm trying to do is kind of open up everybody's minds to more information instead of just being so tunnel vision on everything. And it's been quite a journey. And that's why, again, just hearing and pulling off of your expertise is going to be, I believe, invaluable. So switching on to next topic here. Most Christians read Genesis as a document that stands alone. But you work in the cuneiform record every day. How does that record reframe the opening chapters of the Bible before we even get to chapter 3?
I think people probably, the first thing that they need to recognize is that, the biblical texts weren't written in a cultural vacuum. And that's something that I think is a paradigm shift for a lot of people. I was an evangelical Christian for 26 years. So I grew up in the church, and the first time that I heard that, it was pretty jarring for me. But recognizing that the text, however one wants to classify them, in scholarship we talk about the mythological genre that is Genesis 1 through 11. But however, whatever faith tradition one holds to, and how they parse that out. It is in conversation with, intentionally or unintentionally, the cultures from around that area, and it's no different today. If somebody is writing music, they're intentionally or unintentionally or consciously or unconsciously affected by trends, by popular culture. So these are things that are they're in the water, right? Or they're in the air. And so, at a very base level, I think just understanding that anything that you read from the ancient world, just like you read it today, is going to be affected by that which surrounds it. So I guess more precisely, Genesis, most scholars would say, particularly the first 11 chapters of Genesis, are in conversation with at least Babylonian traditions and ideologies. And so I think understanding that background, understanding that something like in Mesopotamian culture, the city was like the pinnacle of being a real human. A good human is going to be in the city. That's where they're striving to get. So you have lots of texts that talk about, those people that live out in the mountains, those people that live outside of the city, they're all dumb. But the people that live in the city, this is where it's at. So that, the Epic of Gilgamesh is certainly framed that way. But in the biblical texts, in early Genesis, quite the opposite is the case, right? That there's movement toward the city, particularly sort of culminating in the city and Tower of Babel story in Genesis 11. But that's bad movement. It's movement that you don't want. You don't want to be going toward the city. And so God has to keep kind of like spreading them back out. All right, look, rule the world, multiply. You're not doing that. Got to get you out of here. Got to get you out.
Right.
But I think understanding that back and forth and that conversation that the biblical texts in Genesis are having with Mesopotamian culture is really important to understanding more broadly what it's saying.
I think we all have that lens, right, that we read through, and our surroundings and what we are brought up in, kind of frames that out. I see it a lot just in general in Christianity. The subheadings and the titles and the scriptures that you're always constantly brought up on. So you're reading Matthew 24, for example, and there's a big title that says the second coming of Jesus Christ. And so now you're reading it going, oh, look, that earthquake in Texas, man, that's connected to here. And so you already have a lens and a framework. And from what I'm gathering, you're saying, these writers are also being impacted by the surrounding areas as well. It kind of setting the frame for what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And the example that I always like to give is somebody like Eminem. When Eminem writes music, he's very intentionally trying to start a new genre or tweak the genre he's been working in. But he's always in conversation with this artist or this song, sometimes, very distant in the past to him, sometimes, very, very close to him. But nonetheless, he's engaging with it in such a way that if you don't know that he's in a back and forth with R. Kelly, right? That song that he sings isn't really going to make a lot of sense.
Right.
It could still be fun. It could still be an enjoyable song to listen to, but you won't really get when he says, but you already know who the F you are, Kelly, right?
Yeah.
That wouldn't make sense unless you understood that background. I think the same is true with the Genesis narrative and in different ways, but understanding that backdrop really helps to fill it out.
So the Enuma Elish, I think that's pronounced right. Elish, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, but people say it both ways. And
I know I'm like looking up even names and stuff. I'm so terrible. I'm like, there's 10 pronunciations on these things. Right. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation account, predates Genesis. When you put those two texts side by side, what jumps out at you? And what does it tell us about how Israel understood God and creation?
Yeah, big question. So to give everybody a short background, the Enuma Elish is a mythological text that talks about the god Marduk who is the Babylonian deity that gains preeminence, particularly coming into the latter portion of the second millennium and into the first millennium. And in the story, he is faced with what all the other gods consider to be an insurmountable hurdle, and that is the goddess Tiamat. When he all the other gods, are too afraid to go out to fight, and he bravely volunteers to go out. And when he does, he defeats her, and that gives him this preeminent spot at the head of the pantheon. So this text was part of the annual New Year's festival. It was called the Akitu Festival, and every year it was a very an intimate, incredibly important part of the festival. So much so that if you're familiar with the Neo-Babylonian king Nabonidus was gone from. Sorry, the cat's wanting to come up and say hello.
Bring the cats on. Cats are welcome.
Indeed. But he leaves Babylon for roughly a decade, and while he's gone, they can't celebrate the Akitu festival, which is a really, really big deal. So it's an important part of the culture. And so I think what happens is there was a video that Wes Huff was a part of, if you're familiar with who Wes Huff is.
Yep.
And he pushed back on Billy
Carson,
thank you.
Yep.
And there was, so much turmoil centered around that conversation. But much of it was because, the way that Billy was kind of framing it, probably unintentionally, was that it's like a mirror image, right? If you're reading the Enuma Elish and then you read Genesis 1, you're going to be like, oh my gosh, they ripped that off of this. That's not really how that type of conversation between texts, what we call intertextuality, it normally doesn't appear that way. Now, that there are cases where it does. The flood story is one. But in this case, the Enuma Elish, it's far more subtle than that. So if you read Genesis 2 and 3, the Garden of Eden narrative, the one that most people could, kind of give in broad strokes, lay it out. You read that, you get a picture of the deity that is very, very human. He's got some trial and error. Let me try this. Oh, that didn't work. Let me try this other thing. That didn't work. And so he has very characteristics that we resonate with. If you read Genesis 1, however, it's a different story that has the deity far more transcendent, right? He's speaking things into existence. It's a very ordered, poetic text where the first 3 days align with the 4th through 6th days. And it's just a completely different feel when you read Genesis 1. And what scholars have talked about for years and years and years is the interaction between these two is probably one of trying to say, our God, Yahweh, is even more powerful than Marduk, the god, of the land in which we were taken captive for 70 years. And so you can see hints of that. For example, the word tehom in Hebrew is the word for the deep, and that is a cognate. It has a relation to the word Tiamat, who is the sea goddess from the Enuma Elish. And there are things that are a little detailed to go into, probably would bore the listener, but you can. It's not something that is going to jump out at the reader, in my opinion. It's far more subtle than that, but yet they're very difficult, I think, to dismiss. One, for example, that I think is very subtle is that in the Enuma Elish, the goddess Tiamat, after she's killed by Marduk, he splits her in half. And half of her he stretches out to make the heavens, the dome that's overhead. And he places guards in place to hold back the water from coming back down. And this is really the same cosmological image that we get in Genesis 1, right? The rakia, the hammered out thing, is essentially a plate, right? It's like a dome that is used to separate waters above and waters beneath. And so it's little things like that I think Wes was right when he said it's not a one-for-one correspondence. Obviously, it's not one-for-one correspondence. But that doesn't mean that there's not intertextuality between these texts. So
I want to just flip over the conversation to the Gilgamesh epic. Contains the flood story that is older than Noah. Walk us through that parallel. How close is it? What does the existence of that story? What does the existence of that story, and how do we put this together? That's kind of what I'm getting at here.
Yeah. So, in broad strokes, the Mesopotamian flood tradition, I think, arguably goes back to just after 2000 BCE, so in a time called the Old Babylonian period. And you get sort of all springing up roughly at the same time, a Sumerian account or account in the Sumerian language. You get a couple in the Akkadian language. The two famous ones that really affect, I think, the biblical text directly are the story of Atrahasis, which is it's just the flood story. I mean, the flood story is part of a broader narrative about the creation of humanity and their multiplying on earth. And then Gilgamesh Tablet 11, as you pointed out, is utilizing Atrahasis in its telling of the flood story. But basically, it's this: if we think about the bigger story, Atrahasis, that is sort of the base, I think, of both of these texts. The senior gods create lesser deities in order to do this work of caring for the gods, right? Feeding them and clothing them and so forth. And the lesser gods rebel. They don't like it. It's too hard. And so a compromise is struck. They kill the leader of the rebellion of the lesser deities and then use that spark of life or what have you to create humanity. And humanity multiplies. The story talks about how they multiply and multiply and multiply. And they become so numerous that they start making it difficult for one of the senior deities, Enlil, to sleep. And so he says, nah, fam, we're getting rid of them. And so he sends a plague, and he sends drought, and he sends all these, several different things to try to decimate humanity, to try to get their numbers way, way down. And the god Enki, or Ea, consistently, through subterfuge and trickery, helps humanity survive. And it pisses Enlil off so much that in the end he says, that's it, I'm sending a flood. I'm going to wipe them all out. And Ea, being the tricky, wise god that he's sworn, Enlil swears all the major deities to an oath, saying that they won't. Somebody's been telling humanity, somebody's been helping them out. Y'all put your hands up and swear that you're not going to help them.
Right.
And they'll go, I swear. So what Ea does is he goes down, and the flood survivor in Atrahasis, his name is Atrahasis, in Gilgamesh and Utnapishtim, but he goes down, and this guy is standing by a reed fence. And so Ea kind of goes down and he says, hey, reed fence, there's a flood coming, reed fence. You probably ought to build a boat. And so he doesn't break his oath because he didn't tell humanity about the coming storm. He told a fence, so it was fine, right? And of course, the flood comes, and animals are taken up on the ark beforehand. And then at the end, when the flood starts to recede, we have tablets as early as like the 14th century BCE that talk about how birds are released by the flood survivor to fly around and to tell whether the land is receded and all. And of course, you can hear, as I tell that story, if you're familiar with the biblical flood story, you can hear, the overlaps there. But
yeah.
And this is where I think Christians often balk at this unnecessarily.
Okay.
Because I think that when someone says, and I get it, right? When atheists and skeptics, that are trying to come at Christian apologists, say, well, look, it's plagiarizing, it's copywriting, it's plagiarizing the story, and it's just ripping it off. like that's a really unfair look, I think, at what's actually going on there. Because one of the things that we see in the ancient Near East is utilizing an earlier text or storyline and reworking it and emphasizing the differences, because the differences are the things that usually theologically are what's really important. And that's what's happening in the flood story. So the big thing that I always like to point out is that if you were a person in, ancient Mesopotamia as a, like a Judean that had been taken into captivity or something, or maybe had gone back under, the Persian rule, and you heard the flood story, you would recognize, oh man, that sounds a lot like Gilgamesh, right? What's going on in Gilgamesh? But there would be differences that would stand out to you, because one of the things that's really prominent in the story of Atrahasis and Gilgamesh is that the god Enlil is really, really rash. And he's even said to have done a wicked or evil thing in sending this flood. And so the god that's sending the flood is doing something wrong. And the god that rescues humanity is doing something right. Well, when you come to the biblical story, you only have one deity.
Right.
So how, and this is the genius, and why it frustrates me so much when I hear people say those, Bronze Age goat herders, it's what you're reading. No, these are like very brilliant people that are writing these stories.
Right.
And what they do is they bring together both roles into the same deity. And now the deity that sends the flood and the deity that rescues humanity is one and the same. But that left the scribe or the scribal, guild, what have you, with a problem of, well, how do we get this flood sent and have the god like not be evil in doing so? And what they show in Genesis 6:5 is that they have this little 6:1-4 story about the Nephilim and the angels coming down and so on. But then in Genesis 6:5 it says, now like every intent of the thoughts of the hearts of mankind was only evil continually. And the Hebrew there is like super emphatic. It's like humanity was really, really bad. And God is like remorseful about this. And so when you see the picture that is painted of the deity, it's not a deity that's being capricious, that's like, man, I can't sleep, I got to get rid of all them. He's brokenhearted in having to get rid of humanity, but it's because it's their fault. They're so wicked. God has to like start over. And so those are some of the things that I think are really important to recognize when you read the biblical texts in general, but specifically here, is that ask the question. The question to ask is not, is this dependent upon an earlier story? Because I just don't think that matters for theological reasons. I don't think that's an issue.
Right.
Right. Instead, because again, to go back to Eminem, nobody thinks Eminem is not creative or that Eminem is doing something wrong by using, like a Joan Jett song or something. No, he's being very creative and he's doing it for his own purposes. And the biblical writers fall into that same category. Very often they're saying, you have heard that this story was attributed to these deities, but it's not. It's our deity. And look, our deity is not like your deity. Our deity had to do this because mankind was terribly wicked.
Right. Right.
So I don't know.
No, it's a great point. And when I made that comment before about like opening the eyes, one of the things that I personally believe as a Christian is the unhealthy relationship. And this sounds like heresy, but the unhealthy relationship that Christians have with the Bible, in regards to general. My belief, my stance is from, is that I feel that Christians worship the Bible more than they worship Christ, who, my opinion, the Bible points to. And when people say, well, I'm a biblical Christian, I don't even think they understand what they're saying. Well, what biblical Christian? The Genesis Christian, an Exodus Christian, a Christian as in like a follower of Christ? Are you a Mosaean? Are you a Biblian? Like what are we getting at here? And so that's why I think some of these things are really important. And I do think Christians major on minors and stuff, and it's almost like they buck against things that they don't have an answer for, instead of, again, trying to take it. If here's the way I look at it: if faith is real and God is real and Christianity is real, then we as Christians should not be afraid to have any conversations at all whatsoever when new information is being added to it. And that's why your story personally really intrigued me, right? You mentioned before you were evangelical Christian for 20-something years, right? Mm-hmm. And then I believe I have your tweet over here where it was like, I think I'm an atheist, which was just I think that was the only thing you said in that tweet. It was like, I think I'm an atheist now, right? So I guess, actually, I have a question on that. When you married, right? You have kids. When you guys were married, were you both Christian at that time when you were married, or did you get married after that? Because I'm curious to that. Because me and my wife, we pastor a church over here. I don't even know how the dynamic of our relationship would change if I just went to my wife and said, you know what? I don't believe in God anymore. I wonder how that transition was, if that was a transition of yours in your family.
Yeah. So I deconverted when I was still married to my ex-wife.
Okay.
And we were both, we got married because we were both fundamentalist evangelical Christians. Like,
wow. Right.
It was like, oh, look, a guy, and he's a Christian, and I can sort of stand to be in the same room with him for a while. We should just get married, right? I mean, that really was what it was like.
Right.
God will take care of the rest. Not really thought through. But it's interesting because, Megan Lewis, my wife, is she's an Anglican, right? So she identifies as a Christian, and like it's not an issue, because I think being able to recognize that there are other ways of looking at the Bible besides fundamentalist evangelicalism, right? If fundamentalism is not necessary in order to be a Christian. Again, I know, obviously, I have very good friends that are still fundamentalists. Much of my family is still very fundamentalist. But I just don't think that type of biblical literalism is necessary in order to maintain one's faith. But yes, it was a very difficult time for me when I deconverted. Interestingly, I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Michael Brown.
I am familiar with Dr. Michael Brown. Yeah.
So he and I are, I think we're certainly friends. We text each other periodically, but I've been on his the Line of Fire.
Okay.
Radio show. And I went on one time specifically because he said, I want to take two ancient Near Eastern scholars, him and me, because I think he went to New York University which is a phenomenal school. And he got trained in the languages, like we have very similar backgrounds in our education. And yet his biblical training strengthened his faith, and it, led to my deconversion. And so just sort of interacting about that, and I think it was a really good conversation.
That's wild. That's why I want to check that out. That's interesting. But I appreciate you sharing that. It was just something that popped into my head in our convo. All right, I gotta go back to my questions here. So, Israel, they didn't invent the idea of law codes, the laws of Hammurabi or Nama. How do these collections relate to the legal material in the Torah? And what does that relationship tell us about how God worked through a real ancient culture?
Yeah, it's a good question. So to give a very brief background to the audience of what we're talking about, starting at the end of the third millennium BCE, we have what are, we're called early on like law codes, like you said, and they are very often formulated in if this happens, then this will be the judgment. Like, this is what you should do. So they call that casuistic law. But it's if this, then that. And we have those in Sumerian. We have them later in Akkadian. The very famous one that you mentioned, Laws of Hammurabi. They're the longest, most well-preserved version of it that we have. It's a 2-meter high diorite stela that has 282 laws inscribed on it. And so when you think about the various law collections that existed in Mesopotamia, and with the Hittites, like the Hittites have a law collection as well, what happens chronologically is you have this type of legal material in the culture, and scholars are still sort of debating about how they actually functioned, like the laws of Hammurabi, how they actually functioned, and there's no real agreement quite yet about that. But it informs, I think, how we can come to the biblical text, because when you get to particularly like the book of Exodus, you have what's called the covenant code. And that's what scholars call it. It's, right at the end of chapter 20, and it goes through like part of 23. And it's, it's the infamous chapter 21 where all the slave laws are. And so that's the oldest, arguably, law collection that we have preserved in the Hebrew Bible. And then you have the law collection in Deuteronomy. And then I think most scholars would agree that those that are found in Leviticus in the Holiness Code are the latest, the youngest. But I think if we can understand how the laws were structured in something like these law collections, like in Hammurabi, they're probably not normative law. They're probably not like the picture that I always paint is like, I don't think people were, and scholars don't think people were coming to the gate of the city and saying, all right, come here, Frank. Frank stole my sheep, right? And I want to know what you're going to do about it, Mr. Judge. And the judge says, okay, hang on a second. Let me see what Hammurabi says about it. Okay, I see. But okay. All right. So according to law number 17, you're going to be paying 30 shekels of silver. Boom.
Right.
I don't think that's how this is happening.
Gotcha.
There was a way of thinking about law in the ancient world. It's seen through all of these law collections, all of the legal documents that we have preserved in cuneiform. Raymond Westbrook, who is a legal specialist at Johns Hopkins, died the year that I got there, unfortunately. But he had a wonderful saying. He said, law today changes at a frenetic pace, which is now a word that I love to use, but I only use it in that sentence. Whereas in the ancient Near East, it was very, very slow, right? They didn't have, because technology was different. It doesn't move. Life doesn't move
right
at the same rate. And so things didn't have to develop in jurisprudence to kind of keep up with it. And so you'll see things in the laws of Or-Nama, in the laws of Eshnunna, in the laws of Hammurabi that show up in a very similar fashion in the Hebrew Bible. The example that is most famous, I think, is the goring ox laws. So if you look at Exodus 21, 28 to 32, the law talks about if an owner of an ox has been told, hey, your ox has been like trying to gore people as they walk by, and the owner says, nah, okay, it doesn't do anything to keep it penned in or tied up or what have you, and it gores someone, the owner is held responsible for that. And so, like, if it gores a free person, be it the paterfamilias or a wife or a daughter or son or something, then the life of the owner is forfeit, and he can, if the family will allow it, he can ransom out, but his life is forfeit. And then it says, and if it gores a slave, the penalty is he has to pay the owner of the slave 30 shekels of silver. That law is one that is found in at least 2, if not 3, I'd have to go back and look, other law collections with very little distinction between them. Bruce Wells, who's down at University of Texas, Austin, is a legal specialist in the Hebrew Bible in the ancient Near East. And he's got an article where he just sort of looks at the ways that ancient legal specialists thought about law, the types of cases that they thought about, the ways that they would adjudicate them, the types of punishments that they would give. And there's just consistency when you do comparative analysis. And I'll stop talking after this. I wrote in this book, Did the Old Testament Endorse Slavery? I have a lot of comparative material where I'm comparing all the laws about slavery in the ancient world. But in Appendix 2, I compared all the laws about battery. And it's really fascinating to see that even laws about slavery, you can see sort of staying kind of consistent across the board. because you're dealing with the same problems. But their conceptions of harm, like what is the most severe thing to hit on someone, or damage, what costs the most to the perpetrator as a fine if they hit somebody. It's all very, very consistent. And so I think to sort of land my plane here. Sorry about that.
No, it's all good. All good. It's interesting.
I think the usefulness of understanding the ancient Near Eastern law collections is that when you get to the biblical text, you can see like this is, again, it's very similar, I think, to how it works with mythological texts. You don't necessarily camp on the things that are the same. You see what's the same, but you look at what they change. What do they tweak? What are the differences? And two places that I would say sort of stand out to me, and I'll land here. You can see in the law collections about slavery. In Exodus 21, you have laws that say, a law about slavery that says if a male debt slave comes in, you can only make him work for 6 years. You have to release him in the 7th. But he just goes out free by himself. In Deuteronomy 15, which is a later collection chronologically, the law says when that same Israelite slave comes in and works for the 6 years, you don't just release him with nothing. You have to provide for him liberally, it says, from your vineyard, from your threshing floor. You've got to like give him a bunch of stuff, which, even just on its face sounds totally backwards. We just had this guy work for me for 6 years to pay off the debt. Now that he's paid off the debt, I'm going to give him a bunch of stuff. Like, what in the world? And what the law says is it's got the divine, voice behind it. And it, God says, Yahweh says that I will bless you so much. Like, don't count it a hardship to do this, because I will supernaturally essentially intervene to make sure that, this isn't economically detrimental to you.
Right.
And so you see the same sort of thing in Leviticus 25 with like laws about the Sabbath year. God says, let every 7th year, let the land lie fallow for a year. And the text anticipates hey, God, wait a minute. He says, don't be concerned about what you're going to eat during that 7th year, because I'm going to bless you so much in the 6th year that it's going to carry you through the 8th year. Right. So I think those are the things that are different.
Right.
Because they bring, I think, this theological aspect that is the deity is going to step in and have direct intervention into the economically detrimental situation.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about the laws like that, where it's not where we think law today, where it's here, more concept. Let's talk about the gods a little bit. Mesopotamia, saturated with a massive pantheon, right? Marduk, Ishtar. How did Israel's encounter with those gods I guess, shape the development of Yahwism? Do you think the Old Testament is in some ways a direct theological argument against Mesopotamian religion?
Yeah, it's interesting to watch that development sort of take place. And, to be clear to the audience, that there are people that, do Hebrew Bible that specialize in like the divine realm. And so like my old advisor, Ted Lewis, wrote a tome that's over 1,000 pages, and it's called On the Origin and Character of God. And this is like what he does. And so Mark Smith is another big name that, deals with, looking at the development of the divine. But I think what I'll say probably falls pretty well in line with most of what the consensus would say about things. There are places in the Hebrew Bible where you kind of catch a glimpse, as it were, of this tradition that they're bringing with them, this older tradition that they're bringing with them and sort of wrestling through, I suppose. And that is, the Israelites, for all intents and purposes, were a Canaanite group, right? And so, looking back at the ancient city of Ugarit, where we found a whole bunch of tablets, Ugaritic tablets, that talk about the divine pantheon. This is where Baal, is the the Baal that we see in the biblical text. He's worshipped amongst other places up at Ugarit. And so when you read passages like Deuteronomy 32, for example, and you see that, you've got this inheritance that El Elyon is, sort of divvying up to his sons, the sons of God. This is very much in line with like the Ugaritic pantheon, the way that Canaanite culture thought about the divine realm and the pantheon. But if you look at how Deuteronomy 32 is engaging with it, it almost seems like, all right, we have this tradition. The writers or the scribes are like, all right, we have this tradition. We can't just like jettison it. But we need to make sure that we're like turning it in such a way so that it moves toward this monotheistic view that we're either in the process of espousing. And so you start to see, I think even in that passage, scholars would argue that, the canonical form of this, the final form is, Yahweh and El Elyon are starting to line up as the same deity, just like, I guess different names for the deity. But you see the same sort of thing in passages like Psalm 82. And Psalm 82 has, again, the divine council, and Yahweh is inheriting all the nations from these other members of the divine council because they haven't done justice to the poor, to the vulnerable, to the orphan, the widow, and so on. So those traditions, I think, are there. But certainly as, and again, this isn't my area of specialization, so I would obviously defer to the people that work in it. But certainly as time goes by, this view develops in such a way that, I think that probably being in Babylonian captivity, being confronted with in a day-to-day fashion, a multiplicity of divine beings, when you see these texts, like what is it, I think it's Psalm 68, where it says that Yahweh is the rider on the clouds. That's an epithet of Baal. But here, I think it's very reasonable to conclude that the scribe, the psalmist, is saying it's not Yahweh. It's not Baal that's doing that. Baal is not the rider on the clouds. It's Yahweh. Isaiah 27:1, another really good example of this. You have the deity with the twisting serpent and the fleeing serpent. This is almost a direct quote from the Baal cycle in Ugaritic. But again, it's clear that what the text is doing in the Hebrew Bible is saying, it's almost like you can hear Jesus' words, like, you have heard it said.
Right.
That's what comes to mind for me. Like, you have heard it said that this deity is the one that did that, but I say to you,
Gotcha.
that it's Yahweh that did it. And so, I think that sort of circling back to the Genesis 1-11 for a very brief moment, I think that idea of a divine a polemic against the culture, the Babylonian culture, includes a reaction to this, polytheistic, view of the divine. And so I think I think you see all the traditions playing out in the Hebrew Bible in different ways, but I think they're moving toward that sort of monotheistic view.
Was that just a thing in the ancient times of turning monotheistic? As I almost feel like I see a pattern where it's like, I'm going to grab this belief and I'm going to say, no, this is Yahweh doing this. I'm going to do that. Because I feel like I even see this in the New Testament a bit, where you have Hades being mentioned, right? Like, Hades is not a concept, it's a Greek concept over there. And yet Jesus is almost as interacting as if it's real, but it's almost saying, but I'm going to take those keys and I almost feel like in the text that he's almost trying to relate to the audience and kind of putting himself as like, I know you have this thought of what Hades is, but I'm going to walk right in there and just set everybody free. Is that just like a common thing where monotheism is kind of taking that and trying to push everything into it? No, this is like the proof of this is the God that exists.
I'm not sure. Here's what I can say. I think certainly in Mesopotamia in the second millennium, you have the worship of deities is every city has its own deity, right? Sometimes more than one. And by the time you move into the first millennium, though, you've sort of moved not to, I wouldn't even say that it was monolatry necessarily, maybe, but you certainly had a single deity that is becoming far more prominent. So in southern Mesopotamia, that's Marduk, right? And he's the one that's the god of the Enuma Elish. In the north, the Assyrians have Ashur, and Ashur is their national deity. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't other deities and that they weren't worshipped, right? They were, but there does seem to be this, this this movable hierarchy that you start to see single deities moving up. And as time goes by, actually, you even see that process start to, there's a text called Era and Isham. In Era and Isham, it's a very, very violent text. But in it, Marduk, the one that was so powerful, has kind of become like this old man. And now the younger bucks are, vying for that in one way or another. And so, I think I don't think there's any single voice or single trajectory, certainly in Mesopotamia. But there's movement there that I think we can track that speaks to what's going on, and maybe, sheds light, particularly in the Persian period, on what's going on in the worship of God in the Hebrew Bible.
Interesting. Even like the picture, scholars talk about the exile in Babylon as a defining moment for the Israelites' identity, and for the Hebrew Bible itself. How much of what we call Old Testament was shaped by Israel sitting in the middle of Mesopotamian civilization? Because again, something that I feel like we could lean on a lot of scriptures where if I think about it logically, if you're a slave in a specific culture for 100 years and God sets you free, it's not like everything I believe is now pure, holy, mighty, and righteous because now I'm free. You're taking what you think is good and almost like, well, I'm just going to do this for God now, for Yahweh now, instead of doing it to these pagan gods.
Yeah. It's interesting. There's a lot of work in trauma studies now in the field, and I won't pretend to be up on it at all, but I have some friends that work a lot in trauma studies. And certainly that in the Hebrew Bible, the exile is an incredibly traumatic experience. I mean, you think about the Book of Lamentations. I mean, it's just a huge city lament where they've gone into exile and the streets are empty now. Nobody's going up to Jerusalem to worship anymore. And so it's a horrific time for them. And it's certainly trauma does things to the human psyche. And one of the things that I think you can start to see, or you can see even toward the beginning of the exile, is if you read through the book of Ezekiel, when you have as your mindset in the ancient Near East and in the Hebrew Bible that if you're winning, it's because your God is winning, or your God is allowing you to win. Your God is fighting for you. There's a very very, very famous from the third millennium set of texts in Sumerian that talk about a border conflict between two city-states, Umma and Lagash. And Umma has the god Shara over it, and Lagash has Ningirsu, and Ningirsu is like a mighty warrior. And we have this iconography that shows this battle between the people, the armies of Umma and Lagash, and between the deities. And so like in one part of the iconography, you have the gods, the god winning. And on the other side of the iconography, that leads to his city winning.
Gotcha.
This type of correspondence is very, very common. And so when you see the book of Ezekiel and how, that really crazy part in chapter 1 with the wheels and the faces, and they're moving around.
Right.
This is Yahweh's throne, his mobile throne, and he's leaving. And when gods leave, bad stuff happens, right? When the god leaves, that leaves the city or the country vulnerable. And this is how they're reconciling this, right? Why is it that we're struggling? Why is it that we're, being dominated? And it's because the God has left. And this factors in maybe even more so when you get to the book of Daniel. Because if somebody reads Daniel chapter 9, and this would be an interesting, I'm sure you know this, but for anybody that's listening, if you read Daniel chapter 9, start by reading Leviticus 25 and Leviticus 26, and then read Jeremiah 25. If you read those 3 chapters, Daniel 9 will make all the sense in the world to you. Because in Leviticus 25, it talks about every 7th year, let the land lie fallow. And then every 7th seven is 49 years. Then the 50th year is the year of Jubilee. And when you read Jeremiah 25, you see like they're getting booted off the land because they didn't let the land lie fallow, right? They didn't let it rest, and so God's booting them off. Well, when you read Leviticus 26, it says repeatedly, and if you don't obey my commands and heed my voice, I'm going to punish you 7 times more for your sins. So with all of that in mind, when you get to Daniel, the writer of Daniel is looking, from the perspective of Daniel in Babylon. He's sitting there going, I realized by the prophet Jeremiah, right, that 70 years are supposed to come upon us. But then you learn toward the end of the chapter 24 to 27 that it's not going to be just 70 years. It's going to be 70 times 7, which is a callback directly to Leviticus 26.
Right.
And so this, even inside of the text itself, you have this intertextuality, and they're trying to explain why it is that they're still in this underdog position. Why are they still living in turmoil? That they were supposed to be. Deuteronomy said they're supposed to be the head and not the tail, right? They're supposed to be winning. What's going on? And the collective mind, of the people, I think is that cultural understanding of it's not God's fault. We've been sinful. We've been bad. God is just giving us what we deserve. So.
Dr. Bowen, it's been great. Do you have time for a few more questions? Is that good?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, that'll work.
Cool. All right. Genesis 1. Want to get specific about this a little bit more. The 7-day structure, the cosmic waters, the darkness before creation. How does the ancient Near East text clarify what the biblical author was actually trying to communicate? And does it change what we think the text is about?
Yeah. So there are several cosmogonic stories about the creation of the world in Mesopotamia, and certainly in other A&E cultures. I don't have expertise in Egypt, so obviously I won't speak to that. But certainly in Mesopotamia we have these types of cosmogonies, and there are different ways that the world is pictured in its pre-creative state. One of them is water. Another is like the land is super dry and the god has to come and emit certain fluids from his body in order to create the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, right? Like, I'm not kidding. What we see in Mesopotamia is not this idea of creation ex nihilo, right? It's not like the god is speaking into existence from nothing, right? He's working with, or they're working with existing material. And I suspect that's what's happening also in Genesis 1, right? The fact that you have, of course, there's this debate about Genesis 1:1. Is it a dependent clause? It is an independent clause. Is it saying when God began to create, this was the situation? Like, I tend to go that direction. I think it matches up well with the beginning of Genesis 2. But in either case, it looks like you have this mass of water that that's in existence, and it's It's the thing that God is having to, it's the chaos that God is having to bring order to. And of course, just as an aside, if you move forward to the flood account, the priestly version of the flood account, which is what we see, the priestly version is Genesis 1. When we see this in Genesis 6 through 9, God is recreating that primordial waters scenario, right? Because if you think about how Genesis 1 does it, you have the rakia, the hammered out thing that essentially pulls water up above the sky, leaving this, gap in between, and then the land and then the waters go down below. Well, if you read Genesis 7, it talks about how the lattice work, the sluice gates, whatever you want to call it, of the dome, of the rakia, were opened, letting the water come back down. And the great fountains of the deep were burst open and let all that water come back up, creating this Genesis 1 situation again.
Right.
Ostensibly. There's a book out. That's not my idea, by the way.
Right.
Scholars have known that for a while. But Joseph Blenkinsop has a great book. It's entitled Creation, Uncreation, Recreation. And it's looking at this pattern. But I think that for me, if I were trying to give advice to people that hold the biblical text to be sacred in the Word of God, probably the thing to do here is to recognize the genius of what the writers of Genesis were doing. Because again, I know I've said this, but I don't think anybody should lose their faith because the flood story is being, is dependent upon earlier Mesopotamian flood stories. I don't think that should end anybody's faith. I think what should be is there should be a tremendous appreciation for really the brilliance of what these scribes were doing in bringing about their theological positions, bringing their theological positions to bear in text form. And I really think that it's something that once I let go of fundamentalism and that overly literalistic view of the text, it opened the door for me to really see all these very interesting nuances and connections between the texts. And so that's what I think is going on in Genesis 1. It's in a very sneaky way. Sneaky might not be the right word, but a very subtle way. Let me say this. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Something just sort of popped in my head, and it's probably what you were asking now that I think about it. If you read the Anzu myth very, very quickly, the Anzu myth, story about Ninurta, it's an older story. And Ninurta, he's like the major warrior god, and he has to go fight the Anzu bird. And the Anzu bird holds this thing called the Tablet of Destinies, which, like Thanos, controls reality. And he can't beat him. He has to beat him through trickery. The Enuma Elish uses the Anzu myth. It builds off the same story, the same basic structure. But Marduk is so powerful, the god of the Enuma Elish is so powerful that by approaching the god that's holding the Tablet of Destinies, just at his approach, that god is defeated. He doesn't even have to fight him, right? Well, I think what most scholars would see going on in Genesis 1 is that there's not even a fight to be had, right? Genesis 1, there is no approach. There is no battle. That Yahweh just speaks and it's done, right? The Tehom, the thing that is, I think, that would connect in the mind of the listener or the reader to Tiamat, it's not an entity to be conquered, right? It's just a thing that's been completely demythologized, and God just speaks and does stuff to it, right? There's in Genesis 1, there's a reference to what are called the Taninim, and they're like the sea monsters. These are things that have been, I can't remember, it might have been Blenkinsop that said this, but they're like his playthings, right? These things that in other chaos conf texts, see these texts about fighting in order to bring chaos under control, like these are major things to be defeated. For Yahweh, it's just It's another day at the office, right? Speak and it's done.
Right.
So I think that's again, I keep saying it, but the genius of the way that they structure these things, the transcendence of the deity in Genesis 1 is so high relative to other depictions I think of him in other parts of the biblical text.
Right. And to your point about something like this, when you were saying for a Christian, having these stories borrowed shouldn't necessarily break your faith. It goes back to what I was saying before, that I feel like it's that unhealthy view of scripture, where, the Bible is, it's just a big fundamental flaw. The Bible is the word of God, as if God is up there writing down on his notebook, building a paper airplane, throwing it down, people catch it, and here we go. We have a word for word instruction and everything. And if one aspect of it seems to be incorrect, then the whole thing is incorrect. And that starts to wear at people's faith. It goes back to that is not even the way the early church fathers handled scripture and dealt with scripture. And we have kind of formulated this over time. You work in the primary sources. This is why this is so cool. The actual clay tablets. Has there been a discovery or a text in the cuneiform record that genuinely stopped you in your tracks because of what it revealed about the biblical or ancient world?
That's a good question. I don't know if it was stopping me in my tracks necessarily, because of the timing of my deconversion. Well, no. Okay. The Amarna letters. Take it all back. There was. And actually, it's part of why I deconverted.
Interesting.
Because that person that you just described, that if one thing is wrong, then it's all wrong. That was me, 100%.
Wow.
So, when I got to Hopkins, my first semester there, I was taking a bunch of different classes, obviously, but one of them was history of Syria-Palestine. And there is a time in the 14th century where you have all the great kings, king of Egypt, the king of the Hittites, and Mitanni. And hi, baby, how are you? Sorry, one of my twins just decided to come up.
That's all right.
Say hi real quick.
Hi.
No, you need to go back to bed.
Nice to see you.
I love you. All right, going back to bed. I love you like crazy. Love you. Sorry about that.
Oh, good, man.
So in the 14th century, you have all these great kings, Babylonia, Syria, the Hittites, Mitanni, the Pharaoh, and all of them are writing letters to each other. And it's like one of the earliest international like correspondence, like international diplomacy, examples of international diplomacy. And they write things like, they call each other my brother. And how come you didn't see me when I was sick? Even though it's like 3 months to travel up there, how come you didn't come see me? But they're exchanging gifts to one another, and they're complaining about the gifts that they send. You only sent me such and such amount of gold. When I sent my gift, I sent you 10 times that. And these are called the Amarna letters of the Amarna archive because they were found in Amarna, Egypt. Well, those letters are one part of that archive. The other part is like 300, I'm going to say there's like 382 letters between the Pharaoh and rulers in Canaan, in the land of Canaan. And we learn so much from those letters. If you think about the time frame there, the 14th century, like this is the time that, from a traditional view that I don't think many scholars hold to anymore, this is the time that like Israel would have gone into the land of Canaan and taken it. But here we have all these petty kings that are like writing letters to the Pharaoh, and so there was nothing in there about that would have alluded to Israel being in the land. But the other thing that came from that archive and stuff that sort of developed around it just a little bit later was the Philistines. And the Philistines, of course, people that read the Hebrew Bible, the Philistines are like the perennial enemy of the nation of Israel. And I remember sitting in class one day learning about the Philistines and how they didn't come until like around the 12th century. And it was like, wait, like that can't be, because look here in Genesis, like, you know, we've got the Philistines, like this can't work. And so because I had that very fundamentalist view of the text, I remember having conversations with Kyle McCarter, who was, you know, the professor of that class, and just saying, well, isn't it possible that, like, you know, it's just referring to this and maybe, and you know, he would very gently say, well, I mean, I suppose anything's possible, but probably not, you know. But it was so jarring to me,
Wow.
that it really set that's what set me down that path.
Interesting.
So yeah.
Yeah, just the way that I teach the scriptures, I guess the best descriptive word, I heard this guy, Pastor Shane Willard, say it one time, and I've always now use it now, called just an arc of redemption. And I think where the Christians, again, as a whole, just being honest in our conversation here today, with that type of viewpoint where we get it wrong, is that we believe everything is a prescription in the scriptures, where God is prescribing you to do this. And I think that's a very fatal flaw in the scripture versus descriptions. Because when I read the scriptures, I see people, I see stories, I see parables, metaphors, I see wisdom nuggets, but I see them through very, very flawed human beings. And so when David is setting up his best friend to die so he could sleep with his wife, God is not going, hey, I got an idea. I know you like this guy's wife. Kill your friend. Have sex with his wife. That's not. This is a story about what somebody's going through. And so, the way we teach it is the Garden of Eden. You have this environment, and there was a fall, and then I could relate to almost every person in the Old Testament. And then there's this arc of redemption that finalizes in Jesus. And then Jesus, it's not the magic genie in the bottle. It is teaching us a way of life that's contrary a lot to carnality, loving your enemies and turning the other cheek. And, my belief is that if people were actually to live by that, this world would be better. But, we use the name of God and we use the name of Christianity to do a lot of damage in this world. And far too long, I see a lot more people hurt than not. And so, being able to teach it like that really has opened up people's eyes. Now I get crucified here. I'm in Long Island, New York. So I get crucified metaphorically for teaching the Bible like that. But again, it's just, even people like, I asked a simple question in one of our foundations classes, like, you live your whole life off this book, these collection of books. This is the Bible. Do you even know how it got put together? I have no idea. I was like, so you committed 20 years of your life to something. You have no idea how even it's organized. And so we start to break that down and open their eyes up to other books. And I think it's been a really start bringing a healthy relationship, to God, to the Bible, to Jesus, to Christianity as a whole. But I guess my final question, Dr. Bowen, you've been so gracious with your time tonight, and I do appreciate that. There's a version of this conversation that ends with people walking away, feeling like the Bible has been reduced to just one more ancient document. And I don't think that's the right conclusion. How do you think understanding the ancient Near East context actually deepens rather than diminishes the significance of what we call scripture?
Yeah. I mean, at a very basic level, you can't understand, nobody can understand what a Hebrew word means unless they see it used elsewhere. Right. So even something as basic as like, what does the text actually say is something that, it's really difficult to get at that without understanding its ancient Near Eastern context, because, Hebrew is a Semitic language. We have many, many, many more texts that are in Akkadian, which is another Semitic language. And so you have a lot of lexicography that can be done to try to explain what's going on. So I think, at that very foundational level, even knowing what the texts are saying requires, scholars to understand what's going on in the ancient Near East. But I think more than that, I have a friend out at Tyndale, Caleb Howard. He was like my best friend going through Hopkins together. And, he used to teach Genesis at Moody Bible Institute before he came to Hopkins. And I asked him about it one time. I said, how'd you do that? What was your class like? And he said, well, I just had them read all the like Mesopotamian flood stories. We just read them all in full. And then we read Genesis 6-9. I mean, my thought was when he said that, I was like, oh my God, that's going to be like, really, isn't that kind of dangerous to do? And he said, no, like the Hebrew Bible is an ancient Near Eastern text, right? It is. So like it's written by humans, right? However one thinks that they were inspired, they're still the vessel, right, that God is using to write that text. It's no different from, looking at Paul saying something like, hey, Timothy, when you come, make sure you bring that cloak and the parchments.
Right.
Right. There's no way that Paul thought to himself, I can't wait this is going to be a great part of scripture. Man, they're going to read this on Sunday mornings, bring the parchment and my cloak,
right.
So he's a human being writing these things. So how God uses humans, I think it's no different in utilizing ancient genres. Like, let's say God decided to use Animal Farm, right, to get a theological point across. Nobody would balk at that. Nobody would be like, well, that's not a true historical story. Yeah, okay. I mean, that's not the point, right?
Right.
That's not the issue. Nobody has problems with Jesus telling parables.
Right.
They didn't really happen.
Right.
Right. Like they're just parables. And so I think being able to give God the right to utilize humans as he sees fit to get his message across, I think is a very smart way to approach the text. And if I ever did go back, like to Christianity, that would absolutely be my way of viewing the text, is that God is using flawed human beings to get his message across. And it's our job through sensitivity with the Holy Spirit and through prayer and, reading the text and really, thinking on these things to try to ascertain what it is that the message is. But I don't think under that view that it's going to result in God laying out this super easy step-by-step, like you were saying, like throwing the paper airplane down, right? Here are the laws. Like, I don't think that's, it's going to result in reading the book of Judges, right? And going, man, this is some messed up stuff going on here. Certainly, this is not what God wants us to be doing. What is the message here? Oh, the message is there's no king. Everybody's doing what's right in their own eyes. Okay, right? Like, anyway, but I think that's what I would say about it.
Dr. Bowen, this has been really an amazing conversation. Honestly, I think more conversations like this need to take place, and I'm so appreciative of your time. And you spoke so clearly. It was really a wonderful conversation, and I really believe our audience is going to be blessed by it.
I appreciate you having me on. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks for tuning in to the Dig In podcast with me, Johnny Ova. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Follow us on YouTube, and don't forget to rate us 5 stars on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You can also check out more at soh.church. See you next time as we keep digging in.